All right, here we go. Kinesiology 231, Module 7, Training Load. And this is an extension of the conversation from the book, where the book outlines a four-quadrant type of format. And the model itself makes sense. It's great. It's very simplified. Hopefully, implementing in the conversation of general adaptation syndrome will help facilitate a greater understanding of this, or perhaps just take you in a different direction that takes you away from this four-quadrant model and brings you into a different model for training and programming. Okay, your whole goal is to apply the proper training response. The proper training response based on the needs of the person, and the proper training response based on the capabilities and abilities of the person. With that said, you have to be able to balance those two. And a lot of it sometimes is determined by what they're doing, when they're doing it, and what their experience is in terms of fitness, working out, or even just training in general. But the big goal is you're trying to get a training response. So with the general adaptation syndrome, that's really the foundation for a lot of what we do. We're talking about a process of applying stress to the body and how the body responds. And it's a way to have a predictable manner of applying stress, and then a predictable manner of adaptation to the stressors that are placed upon the human organism. And when I talk through this, you'll hear this as we talk, I'll talk a lot about stress and programming, or single-celled organism and human organism, and this will make sense in a second, but I tend to juxtaposition those two with great regularity. So the experiments were, in essence, this. He would apply an electrical stimuli to a single-celled organism, and he would observe the results, and he observed that if it was too frequent or too high a stimulus, there would be a negative adaptation response, or the actual single-celled organism would die. If it was too low of a stimuli, there wouldn't be a training response. There really wouldn't be an adaptation to it. But if he got it just right, he would get an adaptation. And so this has become commonly known as the 3 stages that are alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. I teach this from a standpoint of, you have a person who is in homeostasis and you're taking them through and applying a stressor to them, so you have to take them out of homeostasis. So I often talk about the homeostasis of the person or the human organism, and then applying a stressor to it to get the person to go through the alarm, the resistance, and then hopefully never the exhaustion stage. But the big thing is, when you look at the pictogram here, it's like you got the homeostasis, the person's at rest, you apply the stimulus, they go through the alarm stage. If it's too much, then they go into exhaustion. If it's just right, then they have a training response or an adaptation. All right, got it. So it's really been adopted to the point where it's a key component of what we do for working with our people. And with stressors, you apply stressors to the human organism, and there's some that kind of operate in the background anyways, and some can be kind of positive and some can be negative, but it becomes how our body processes those stressors. And here's a great example, right? We all have work, we all have family, we have bills and home issues, we have stuff with school, and then we also have our workouts. And with this, you got to look at it and go, things cause stress, but there's stress that can be, in some regard, controlled, in some regards are out of our control. And you can only basically control what you can control. But these guys, if you really take it to its essence, right, they provide a stressor in the body, and how they're processed by the person can differ, right, because you have different people who respond to stress differently. But to some theoretical degree, our body takes that stress and processes it in 2 main ways through the autonomic nervous system. It's either going to be fight or flight, which is on the sympathetic side of that, or rest and digest, which is more on the parasympathetic side of that. And when we get into our next presentation about ways to evaluate, we'll talk about having heart rate and how heart rate can be evaluated to determine if a person is in fight or flight or rest or digest. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So in some regards, stress is stress. It's only stress. But I'll tell you, stress is not just stress. Stress is processed by different people differently, and you have to know kind of what you're working with some individuals, because some might be more tend to being upregulated in fight or flight, the sympathetic side, or upregulated on the parasympathetic side, and you have to kind of be able to evaluate that when you work with your people. So as I noted, I tend to juxtaposition the original research by Selye with the training environment. Single-celled organism, human organism, electrical stimulus, training stimulus, cellular adaptations, training adaptations, and you can probably bet you're going to see that somewhere else down the road. And the reason you look at it from that perspective is if you start to now view this less as a four-quadrant process, but more like a process of applying stimulus to get a response, to have the external training load, if I use the book jargon, be just right, so we don't have too much of an internal training load, as the book defined, where the person becomes overwhelmed. Again, I look in terms of here's a stress applied to the human organism and how the human organism responds, and trying to get a training response. And if I do that correctly, we have a nice virtuous cycle. If I do that incorrectly and it's an overstressed training environment, then we'll have deleterious effects. So you have to look at this and go, okay, have they had the right training stimulus? And even looking at the four different sports that are down there, tennis versus soccer versus football versus baseball, you can use that as just kind of a concept of looking at, okay, those are different sports with different demands, and even within the sport themselves, there's different demands with these sports right here in terms of position. And so you have to look at, okay, what is appropriate? What is the desired training response? And then what is the proper amount of stress that you want to place on the human body? Look back to our conversation with my offensive lineman, Sully, versus my running back, Antoine, who were vastly different in terms of what position they played, and vastly different in terms of their training age, and vastly different in terms of their pound-for-pound capabilities. So what comes to light in this process is the term of periodization. And periodization is the systematic programming of applying a training stimulus to elicit a training response to maximize gains and minimize the possibility of overtraining. And so you're trying to prepare your people for the properly for their sport. You're trying to prepare people as best you can based upon the person that's in front of you, because you can only work with the body that's in front of you. But to a certain degree, the training methodology is driven by the needs of the person and what they need to do to prepare best for their sport. And it's the same thing if you're prepping somebody to go on a beach vacation or they're going to try to fit into a wedding dress. You know, the training and methodology that you use has to be aligned with what you're trying to accomplish. Makes sense, right? So we know this. We know that if we have too much, no good for the organism. Too little, the organism adapted only so far, and just right, it adapted and will continue to do so. Alarm, resistance, exhaustion. Those are the big three, and I throw in homeostasis. And your people, as you take them through a program, you'll have to vacillate your workouts, and it gets back to the conversation that we had, like how to apply a stressor. And if we start to look at these side by side, we have general adaptation syndrome, two different models here, one of which is how the body responds as it goes through the initial shock and compensation phase, and then resistance, and then if you overtrain a person, then what happens? More simplified graphical interpretation where you're at homeostasis, you apply a stimulus, it goes through alarm stage, the body starts to recover and react, and then if you continue with the same stimulus, it'll go through exhaustion. And if you look at these and you compare them with what is a traditional training response model, you have this homeostasis, you apply a stimulus in training, you'll have a negative response. If you want to think of this in terms of internal training load, as per the book, you'll have this negative response, and then the body starts to recover as it gets stronger, and then it goes into supercompensation. Now, your mission, if you choose to accept, is to take people through a vacillating schedule that does this in a virtuous cycle, up and up and up, and not this, where you end up having them in this exhaustion stage. So let's go ahead and take a look. This you may recall from before. We had intensity and reps and 30 reps for each one of those, and we tried to define what is hard. What is a hard workout? And really what we're trying to quantify is what is the stress? What is the stress being applied to the person, and in what quantity? And it gets to another conversation. Okay, we had this one with the Omni exercise scale, which was okay, but it really didn't differentiate between is 3x10 an 8, a 10-8-6-4-2, is that an 8, or is 5x6 an 8? And we talked about the download weeks, how that slides the scale from 8 down to 4, which is appropriate and exactly what you want to do. So now if we take this and we go from homeostasis, and we have the blue line, which is training load, as dictated by some of the reps and sets that we talked about before, with the percentages underneath, and we look at the training response. When we apply that training load, we're going to have an alarm stage where the person has a little bit of a negative effect as their body's responding, but then their body will start to compensate and they go through this resistance to the stimuli. As you continue to work with the person, you'll have this upward cycle as you continue to also adjust the training programming, and you'll see a response in terms of them going through alarm and resistance, but they're not in exhaustion yet. That's not what we're after. And as you look at this over 12 weeks, you then increase your training load up until about week 10, and then you have that download week, 2 sets of 5, so we decrease the loading parameters, 3 sets of 5, and then you get into a test out. So this would be very analogous to what we were talking about with a level 1 type of client or a level 1 type of athlete. And what ends up happening with this model is you basically have a recovery time, another recovery time, and what you'll hear even like now going into the Olympics, with this recovery phase, it's almost like a taper phase where you back off the training volume and then you allow for what's called a super compensation cycle for the person to then be able to overshoot and then be able to recover and compete at a very high level. You don't want your people going into the Olympics being exhausted. You want them fresh, poppy, and explosive, and you want them in an overshooting or overcompensation phase, not in an alarm stage. No, 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 no. So this training load becomes important in terms of how you apply the stressor to the human organism to get the training response that you want over time. So really, when it comes down to it, proper programming requires an understanding of like all these different requirements and demands. So as the trainer and the coach, you're really trying to now skeletonize what are the requirements of the activity, what are the demands of the activity, and what is it they're trying to accomplish, and then where are they in the big cycle of programming. And you're trying to craft your programming to be very specific to that, and that is referred to as specificity in training, and you're going to probably see that somewhere else. So it holds true for the general population as well. You know, anytime a client comes in and the first time they work with you, they're going to be in homeostasis. Some will have worked out before, but you're going to hit them with a training stimuli. Their bodies are going to respond. And I can tell you that no matter what, during the first couple of weeks, their bodies are going to respond anyways, because they're so deconditioned that even if you do just 3 sets of 10 or 2 sets of 10, over the first couple of weeks, you're going to find that they'll get a training response. But you have to be crafty enough to be able to not allow them to go into that negative phasing of exhaustion and try to get them to go through a recovery cycle. And that's kind of the other part of this equation, is how do you allow for recovery? And that'll be another presentation here in a moment. So it really requires you to balance applying the right stimuli correctly that is appropriate for the activity, and then be able to incorporate in these recovery protocols that will allow this to happen, whether it is active types of recovery or it's passive types of recovery. If you're doing ice bath modalities, foam rolling, types of stretching, massage therapy, making sure you get plenty of sleep, contrast showers and baths, whatever it is that is suggested. You're trying to basically take people and push them aggressively through this alarm stage into this resistance stage to get the response that you want and training adaptation that you want, and then provide recovery protocols so they don't slip down into exhaustion and they keep having that positive slope. So you're trying to basically keep your athlete from being overtrained. And that overtraining has a couple of different functional areas to it that isn't just physical. There's psychological, emotional drains that come from training and having rigorous training. So to that end, guys, hopefully this helped you guys with general adaptation syndrome. You can definitely kind of compare that 4-quadrant matrix that the book provides with general adaptation syndrome and the stimuli that are applied to get a training response. And then you look at that external training load, which are the stimuli, and how the body responds, which is the internal training load in the book. Again, I'm not a big fan of that model in the book, but you can use this to help adapt to that. All right, guys, thank you so much. Signing off.